This is a kind of maybe not surprising story about the fact that young people are doing fewer things face to face with other human beings than they previously once did, and kind of the downstream effect that Bern Murdoch is interested in this article is that it's having bad mental health effects. I think that is a bad thing itself. I think it's controversial take. My controversial take is that I think it's good when people have good mental health. However, I also just think it's probably bad socially in that kind of sense of the effects on society. That is happening as well. It's probably also bad politically, economically, all of those things too. A world of isolation and loneliness is not a great one for the politics that might emerge out of that. It probably also isn't great economically because people going out and doing stuff is one of the things which keeps money kind of moving around our economy. John Bern Murdoch here has taken data from a number of different countries' time use surveys. Effectively, these are surveys which they send out a sheet to, I don't know, 1,000 people, probably at least, for a kind of representative survey, maybe 2,000. Anyway, so they send those thousands of people at like a form, and they say, fill out, like use a stopwatch and measure what you're doing for every minute of the day. So, I just spent 5 minutes reading. I just spent 32 minutes driving my car to work. I spent 4 hours at work. I spent an hour at the dentist. All of that stuff. So it'll literally go like, everyone has 24 hours in the day, but like how much time do people spend sleeping? Men do an average of 8.77 hours sleeping. Women sleep for an average of 8.9 hours. People spend 1.18 hours eating, spend 1.84 doing household activities, and it goes like reasonably granular. And basically it's interesting in and of itself in terms of like just looking through these sheets for each year and going like, oh cool, that's interesting. People spend 0.16 hours every day doing telephone calls and opening letters and sending emails. But it's particularly interesting over time, right? Because you kind of see these shifts in how people use their time over time. Do they start to do more sports or less sports over time? Do more people start doing religious activities or less people? Are more people volunteering or not? You can kind of see these really interesting shifts in terms of how the US population or the UK population or European population is spending their time. And so what Bern Murdoch has done is sort of taken that data and looked at it over time, particularly focusing on, looking at people sort of across the ages, to see how that's changed over time. And this seems to be a little bit different in Europe. The kind of shape of some of these looks a little bit different. But what has always happened is that as you get older, more of your time is spent alone. Which kind of makes sense if you think about it. That, I know that when I was at university, right, I lived in a shared house with, one of the houses I lived in had like maybe 10 other people. And I would presumably spend some time in my room chilling or something, but most of the time I'd spend in the living room chatting to different people throughout the day. And because there were so many people in that house, you're like seeing someone constantly. You're then going out in the evening to do something fun, or you're going to a lecture or whatever. If you are at school, in a secondary school or primary school setting, spending your break time just going like, actually, guys, I'm just going to chill on my own in the corner, that is socially not particularly acceptable. And then, as you get a little bit older at work, it is entirely acceptable to go, even if you work with lots of people, to go, hey, everyone, I need to go and get my lunch. I'm going to walk to the shop. And someone goes, I don't know, do you want someone to walk with you? And you go, no, actually, I kind of fancy a little stroll on my own. As you got older, you probably are just more settled in yourself and you want to spend a bit more time alone. But if that starts to happen later in life, you've probably got options of socializing and you're like opting not to. Whereas when you are younger and you might like to be socializing more, that you are kind of thrust into those scenarios in maybe ways that are positive. And particularly what gets drawn out if we look at these graphs is that after about the age of 40, things have remained fairly similar. But it seems to be this younger patch where there's suddenly grown a much bigger gap in terms of how much time people are spending alone, right? But 20-year-olds are spending like quite a significant amount of quite significantly less time with other people than they once did. The sort of vision of what things maybe used to look like is that when you're 20, you're out at the pub all the time, you're out clubbing all the time, you're going to bars, you're going to parties or whatnot. And that seems to have just reduced as the amount of time people are spending alone has skyrocketed. Agrippina 2023 says, is socializing not possible online whilst also being at home? And I do think this is alone at home. And I do think this is an interesting point. And this is something I've seen come up in conversations around social media use as well. I would say the quality of socializing that one does online is probably lesser. I don't know. In some ways, I don't think that's super controversial to say. I remember like years ago, and I do mean years and years ago. Like when I was a teenager, I remember my mum mentioning an article she'd read where they'd been discussing the ways that people that got to know one another online through, like, in those days it would be like MSN. Whether they'd met in person first and then started talking online, or whether they'd met and started talking online first thing, got to know one another much quicker than people who were talking in the real world. Because in many ways, there's kind of less fluff. Okay, if I meet someone through work or something, and I'm like, this person is going to be my friend now, and we decide to go to the pub, then you spend, the first 10 minutes arranging the logistics of the drink. You then probably do a lot of small talk about how's your day? Oh yeah, got the bus here and the bus was late and all of this. And there's quite a lot of like waffle time, and maybe eventually you get down to like the nitty gritty, like heart to heart stuff. However, if you're MSNing or chatting in Instagram DMs or whatever it is these days, I definitely sounded old then. Because there's not the like social thing if you're talking to a human being and therefore you don't want to offer up things. Like sometimes it's easier to type something out and send it. But also because there's not all of that waffle time, you just get to the point a little bit more. However, like all of that waffle and all of those like social cues of being with another person and trying to work out how to trying to get to a point with another human being where you can have a heart-to-heart in person across a table, like those are social skills, and when that happens, that is like a rich human experience in a way that maybe having those conversations with someone you don't know in real life or you do know in real life maybe as well, like in a WhatsApp chat, maybe isn't quite as rich a phenomenon. Like, I don't feel that acknowledging that is to be like, oh, kids these days, they don't speak to one another. But I do still think it is true, maybe. Going back through this, there is also like a really clear thing amongst young people where you see that if the difference here between 2023 and 2010 is a huge amount more time spent alone in all of these cases, then using the American Time Use Survey data, you just see that 18 to 24-year-olds, like the percentage of the time which is spent alone has increasingly been time which is spent online. You know, if you go back to this kind of metaphorical sort of ideal of the pub that I seem to have conjured up, there is also this thing wherein if you do go to the pub, then you might go to specifically with the idea of meeting and speaking with person A, but when you get there, you bump into person B and person C, and you end up speaking with them. And you might not have chosen to meet them, but they might turn out to be really nice. They might not even become your best friend, or there is a social connection that you have made, and that might be useful to you in a way. That, or like to look at it in a real like game theory way, but also, you know, emotionally they might have something, or they might have something to offer your life. You might have something to offer their life, and if you if you're just messaging people online, you're really choosing the people you speak to. And so then it kind of goes into kind of some of the well-being stuff, and kind of I think that the kind of thrust of this article is to look at the ways in which those increases in time spent alone has impacted young people's mental health. But I do also just kind of think it's bad in lots of ways, and I think both culturally and politically, and even like you see it guiding sort of economics in terms of like the products that we are offered and the services that we are offered. I do think, without wanting to kind of do like a cultural decline kind of narrative, one of the challenges of the coming decades, is that there are kind of less scenarios in which we are forced to be with people that we don't think are the best people ever. And I don't mean this in a kind of echo chambers kind of way, like everyone's in their echo chambers, man, and that's bad. But I do think the kind of decrease in social skills that maybe allows also means we're less good as a society at tackling some of the big stuff. So Robert Putnam wrote a book in the 2000s, which looked at particularly data about drops in like people being engaged in sort of community associations. So there's like a bunch of data which shows that over the course of the second half of the 20th century, you basically see these big drop-offs in people being members of community groups. So that might be religious groups like churches or other faith groups, but also trade unions, parent-teacher associations, Boy Scouts, Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks, Freemasons. Like, membership of all of these groups began to drop, which is really interesting in terms of the fact that, you know, we look at this data and there's the temptation to think that this is a very, very new thing, whereas actually this is a problem which we've been dealing with for some decades, in terms of the fact that the ways in which we spend our time seem to have become much less social, in the simplest possible way. And, the implication here is that it's the internet, but actually, the data that Putnam is looking at starts in the 1950s, right? And so he's looking at the suburbs, I would, as like part of it. Like, what's his kind of suggestion? So he estimated that the fall off in civic engagement after 1965 was 10% due to pressure of work and double career families. Yeah, that makes sense, right? In an era, and a very brief era, it's worth saying, where some middle class women didn't have to work. It's always worth kind of framing this. Those women were able to be involved in parent-teacher association and volunteering and all of this other kind of stuff. 10% to, if both couples in this sort of stereotypical heterosexual marriage that I've now conjured up, and they're both at the pub. If they both have to work, then that the woman in this stereotypical heterosexual relationship no longer can be doing that volunteering. 10% to suburbanization, commuting and urban sprawl, 25% the expansion of electronic entertainment, especially television, and 50% to generational change, although he estimated that the effect of television and generational change overlapped by 10 to 15%. 15 to 20% remain unexplained. And I think it kind of... I think there are both these structural factors, some of which are like urban design, some of which are labour market factors of people feel like there is more work pressure, whether or not that is true. And there's kind of some debate over that. Some of it is like the technological stuff of if you've got cool options of stuff to do at home, then you might not go out. There's also like economic factors. So one of the big things that so Tim Martin, who is the owner of Wetherspoons in the UK, one of his big things that he campaigns on is the fact that supermarkets in the UK have to pay much less tax on the alcohol they sell than pubs do. And that is ahead of the fact that, for every pint that a pub wants to sell, it needs a seat for the person that's going to drink that pint to sit in. It needs to pay the rent on the building. It needs to have all the kit to do it. Whereas for every can of beer that a supermarket sells, it's just piling those things high, right? It can sell so much more booze than a pub can for much less of a cost. And one of the outcomes of that is it's so much cheaper to just go and buy a bunch of tinnies at the shop and sit at home and watch the TV and drink them than it is to go to the pub and have a drink and bump into some friends. And so there are economic factors as well of it has become quite expensive to go out, and that probably is part of the things that both part of the trends that both Putnam was looking at back here, and is probably part of this, right? When I was 20, which wasn't all that long ago, and if this was your thing, you could go out with friends and go clubbing and get incredibly drunk incredibly cheaply. We used to go out and you could, like, if you spent £20, you'd be very drunk, right? You'd be very unhappy the next day. These days, I rarely see a pint for less than like £4-5. Like that would you feel like you were somewhere that had a good deal. And so part of it is that it's just expensive to go out, and that's kind of a cyclical, circular thing, right? Is that if the price of drinks in the pub goes up, less people go to the pub, therefore they have to put their prices up, therefore less people go, and you kind of end up just circling the drain a little bit. I do also think, and I'm usually incredibly skeptical of sort of cultural arguments as the like main motivating factor for stuff, but I think as time has gone on, I do think that there has been a cultural shift wherein going and spending time in a place with people you might not know, and you might bump into some people that you don't want to bump into, and like, oh, it's going to be noisy and all of that, like, has also probably become part of it. Like, there has been a cultural shift where we would rather just be in our houses and we can talk to the people we want to talk to. And there's sort of a politics to that as well, right? That bleeds into the way in which we think about the world around us and our place within it in ways which I don't think is particularly great. I was also thinking in this, there's like a weird point in your life where between the age of like leaving school and university and the age of either having children or just becoming an age at which you start to use healthcare services and stuff like that, where you kind of become unmoored from the sort of collective institutions of life, because generally speaking, people in these ages are a little bit healthier, so you're not engaging with services in that way, and you're mostly kind of thinking about your career or whatever. This is kind of lowest common denominator kind of look at the world. This is not true for everyone. But in an era where more people were like having children at 20, 21, 22, you'd still have that connection to some kind of like collective life of the world around you through the fact that you are dropping kids off at school and picking them up. And the place where that remained was the workplace. And that has now started to drop because there's a lot more working from home. And I think the conversation on working from home is really interesting too. Like, I mostly work from home. I quite like it in the sense that it allows me to like focus on my work, and I'm possibly at times at least more productive because I'm just cracking on, in a sense that maybe in an office setting I would like I think when I am around people, I am quite sociable, so I will just chat away and then just be like, oh, I didn't get anything done. And the ways in which, and yet sometimes I'm like, well, is that really antisocial that I actively think that that is a good thing? I think there are really clear arguments, like sort of workers' rights arguments for working from home being a thing that is available to people, and I think people should have the ability to request and or even demand or whatever, but kind of, you know, at risk of doing the going back to the old man argument, at what point is like there are very legitimate arguments for people not wanting to spend an hour a day sat in a car. Like that isn't something that I'm sort of suggesting people should have to do. But is there also an element where people are like, I don't really want to see anyone that I work with? That feels less positive. Like, if you look back to some of the institutions that Putnam's talking about, so whether that is sometimes the Freemasons, the Rotary clubs, whether that is like labour unions, a lot of those find members through work, right? For a lot of the more social democratic years of the 20th century, the ways in which people found bonds were you ended up doing a job with a bunch of people, and like, yeah, you they might have not all been great, or they might not have all been people that you chose to hang out, that you'd particularly chosen, but they were people that you ended up being friends with because you had a shared situation and all of this. And there were real, like, positive social and political things to come out of that, right? In many ways, the genesis of the push for democracy itself, right, let alone the more specific kind of workers' rights stuff that happened slightly after that in the kind of birth of the labour movement, kind of pushes for reform, particularly talking in the UK context, came because people were kind of thrust together in big industrial cities and ended up working in close proximity to one another. The kind of second order political effects of people going to work together were quite positive. And so again, obviously, lots of people don't want to do a commute. That aspect of it is, like, cool. That's fine. Like, that's completely understandable. The thing in terms of, like, I don't want to hang out with anyone that I've not specifically chosen to hang out with, I do think some might lead us down a path where no one ends up really hanging out with anyone. Because, like, in many ways, right, the human condition is that you are a person with a particular way, like, with, like, things that you want to happen, and yet you have to, and, like, free will, and yet you have to share the world with lots of other people who also want that to happen, and we have to sort of devise ways to live with one another where we can't always do the thing we want to do, and neither can all the people, because we can't all do that, and therefore we have to, like, sort of work out a way that we can sort of all do sort of some of that. Like, and I know this really goes back to the basic stuff, but I do sort of think, like, it just goes to something really fundamental in our politics, right? Because I think there is a connection between this stuff and, like, the sense among lots of people that like, everything being privatized is good, and particularly, like, governments are bad. Like, that's kind of a fairly widely held belief across quite a lot of the political spectrum, is that governments can never do a thing well, right? Which, if you view the government or the state or whatever as sort of a bureaucracy which exists over there and does things to you, that's quite easy to get on board with that. However, if you view government, the state, like, political institutions, as a thing to which you contribute some direction, but other people contribute some direction as well, and, like, between us we try and make this thing, this, and, like, the state sometimes as a kind of product of our collective decision making, then it becomes something slightly different. However, this world in which, you know, we do have just so much more of this kind of social atomization is a world in which the idea that we can do something good if we all work together or whatever, like, in the sort of, like, vaguest way of putting that, just begins to see impossible. Just begins to look impossible, I think.